So, do you know what a repository is? In programming, a repository can be seen as a central hub, which contains folders and files. And each file contains code, which can be performing some function by grabbing some data here, passing it to another file. That file can be performing some function off that returned value and passing that into another file. So you can think of as a repository as a collection of code snippets that are all working in unison to perform some function that's a major critical part of how an app needs to operate as a whole. All of the biggest organizations all have repositories, and even small developers such as myself have multiple repositories where we store projects, pieces of code that we want to iterate off of, keep track of how we built up to its current version, and we can submit issues to make it better, and here's what we want to change with it. It's very important for a lot of people to have their own repositories where they store all the information about what they're doing with their project. When we think about it, I think our life is exactly the same way. When you think about it, you are your own repository. You have your past versions, which have built you up to who you are now. You have your present self, which is the current state of your own repository. And you have your future self, which is where you're moving into or what you're slowly iterating to building up to over time. And so when you think about it, you are a repository, and we're always pulling in information from other repositories that exist out there in the ether, in universal time continuum space. I think we're always building out ourselves from multiple different databases of information that exist as collective consciousness bubbles. So when you think about it, our reality is a dynamic computing system where here we are existing within universal space, and we're always pulling in information from different places, different angles, different lines, and we're using that to return into ourselves to then build out our world from. And all of who you are, all of what you want to be, exists somewhere within pulling in data from here, pulling in data from here, and here to use to optimize yourself in all the ways that you need to. Our life, in a lot of ways, is like a project. We're always building ourselves. We're always slowly iterating ourselves into a next better version of what we want to be. And I think that the more I've learned to program and code and utilize these concepts, the more I've been better able to see how it directly fits in with life. Because another cool thing about repositories is essentially this. Your repository is something that people can collaborate with. If someone sees there's an issue, if someone sees there's some piece of code that isn't quite written right or it could be written better, you can always submit a request to then say, hey, here's the solution that I've made for this file within this code. Can you take this file and then publish that as the new change? I think that when we're looking for ideas, when we're looking for new thought forms to develop ourselves from, to build our world from, we're doing essentially the same thing. And I think the internet as a whole has been playing out that function for us. We always can go online, search for any point of view, any perspective, and we can use that to adopt new ideas to build a world from. So that's the very action of pulling the information in, perhaps, replacing it with other information that we had previously. And we're always pulling in information into ourselves to make ourselves better in some way. Some information we pull into ourselves, it doesn't make it better. But for the most part, it seems like our life, we're always trying to gather information to improve our current state so we can move into a much better state where we're more optimized in some way. Now, I get it, this may not be at the forefront of the majority of people's conscious mind, but this is something that's happening, I think. Us as human beings, we're always looking to move forward in some direction. The direction of perhaps even relief of past pain, the direction of what we want, the direction of our goals and desires. And I think that when we move forward from that instance where we have our goals and objectives laid out in front of us and we slowly move towards that, I think that relieves all the past problems of what we think that we have to deal with as we relate directly to our past. See, as programmers and developers, we're always looking at the current state of our project and what can be better. So the natural iteration is that we're always looking at the present moment and moving forward. We don't really look too much back at the past versions of our code because our code that we have now is the current display of all the past decisions that we've made to have it be where it is now. Sometimes we may look back to reference how we did something, but for the most part, all those changes are directly reflected in our present code now. And when you look at your own reality, it's exactly the same way. You are who you are right now due to all the past decisions that you've made, past events that have happened to you, past events that you've been included into experiencing, and here you are. And ultimately, it's all about what are you going to do now with where you currently are, and how are you going to move towards the future in some direction which you've outlined that you want to go in. So I think goal setting also is a very important aspect to design your reality. Because if you're just coding away, doing things that you don't really know what you're doing or why you're doing it or how it fits into a larger picture or is interacting with another thing, you won't really know what it is you're doing or why you're doing it for. So it's very important to also know where you're going in life, where you want to go. But I think also it's important to recognize that your goals and ambitions and desires is more like a placeholder to prompt you to get you to go in a direction. It's not necessarily about the thing itself, it's more about getting you to move in the direction of what that can bring you. And if you don't achieve necessarily what you want to achieve, that's fine because it always was about the journey. You talk to any rich person, any successful person, they'll always say that I'd trade in all my money to go back to my younger years because that was when I was building, that's when it was the most fun. It's the most fun when you're on the journey of creating yourself, not at some end point. And in software, there is no end point. You can always make some change, you can always edit your file in a different way or rearrange it or try a new framework or rebuild your app in a whole other different paradigm. The movement is always constant. You can always do all these sorts of things with your code to make it better. And ultimately, you can get to the point where all the changes that you make are just tweaking 1 or 2% in better performance or functionality or accessibility or whatever. It doesn't really make that much of a difference. And I think that when it comes to designing your life and your reality, you have to think about what are the things that you can take right now that are the biggest movers that have the highest probability of creating a change in an outcome that you want. What can you do right now that's going to give the highest probability of producing an outcome that actually is going to benefit you long term or even short term? Just whatever is going to help you grow in the next direction instantaneously. That's personally what I try to do. I try to think about what can I do now that actually is going to help me get to the next step of where I need to go, and what can I do with that information to then go to the next step. And in a type of linear style, that's also what coding is. You're coding one piece of function which is going to be a building block to act for another function to do another thing, and that function is playing a role by pairing with this other function over here. Our life is exactly the same way. And sometimes you have to construct all these variables in like the mental world, sometimes in the physical and tangible world, sometimes like in the emotional world or the internal world. All of who you are, you're always interacting with your own repository, your own inner library system. So that's what I would suggest for you is to start to think of your life as a repository. Create sections of yourself where you try to define where do you actually exist in these different places? Where do you exactly exist within all these different places within your mind, within your body, within your spirit? Where are you located and where are you pulling information from?